The silence was my oldest companion. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, dismissive blanket smothering my existence in the gleaming halls of the Ethelgard Corporation. For years I was a ghost, my ideas whispered into voids they called meeting rooms, my presence a mere formality at a table of titans. They saw my charts, my data streams, my relentless logic as quirks of a strange, unsocialized mind, interesting perhaps but never essential. I was the architect of systems they used but never understood, the foundation upon which their glittering empire stood, forever condemned to the cold, dark earth beneath their feet. Their indifference was a constant, low hum of pain, a reminder that my worth was conditional on my invisibility. Then the sky fell. The Ethelgard Cascade. They called it a digital plague of their own arrogant making. Their servers, the lifeblood of global finance, began to bleed out, crashing in a wave of screaming red alerts. The brilliant minds, the charismatic leaders, the ones who always knew better, stood paralyzed before the abyss they had carved with their own shortcuts and bluster. Panic, a scent I now know well, replaced the expensive cologne in the air. And in that glorious, terrifying moment of collective ruin, their heads one by one turned to me. The silence finally broke, not with an apology but with a plea. The weight of their desperate gazes was a heavier crown than any of them could ever bear. I looked at their ashen faces, at the flickering screens reflecting their impending doom, and I felt the old, aching wound of their disregard harden into something cold and unyielding. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. They needed my help, and I had just decided on the price. The silence began not as an absence of sound, but as a presence of disregard. It was a tangible force in the sprawling glass and steel office of Ethelgard Corporation, a place where the hum of servers and the soft click of keyboards composed a symphony of progress to which I was never a credited musician. My desk was situated in a quadrant of the floor known unofficially as the archive, a polite term for a place where projects were sent to die, and where people were stationed to be forgotten. The light there was different, perpetually diluted by the shadow of a structural column, a constant architectural metaphor for my career. I was not disliked. That would have required an emotional investment my colleagues were unwilling to make. I was simply processed, a data point in the system, a necessary but unremarkable component like a redundant power supply, invisible until the moment it was critically needed, a moment everyone assumed would never come. My invisibility was a carefully constructed artifact, built not by me, but by the collective consensus of those around me. I remember the early days, the flicker of hope that would ignite in my chest before a strategy meeting. I would arrive, my notes meticulous, my projections having already accurately predicted market shifts they were only now beginning to fear. I would wait for the lull in the conversation, the moment of uncertainty, and then I would speak. My voice, however, seemed to operate on a frequency to which they were deaf. The words would leave my lips, hang in the air for a moment, and then dissolve into the sterile, recycled atmosphere. There would be a beat of that heavy, dismissive silence, and then the conversation would simply flow around the space where my contribution had been, like water diverting around a forgotten stone in a stream. Sometimes, a week later, the department head would present my exact idea, polished with different jargon and delivered with a confident smirk, to a chorus of admiring nods. The theft was so blatant it felt less like malice and more like a natural law. The universe, in their eyes, had simply corrected an anomaly, moving a valuable thought from an unworthy vessel to a more suitable one. This erasure extended beyond the boardroom and seeped into the very social fabric of the workplace. The invitations to after-work drinks that were extended in booming voices to everyone in the vicinity would somehow fail to reach my ears. My presence at the coffee machine was a signal for others to finish their conversations quickly and disperse. I was the human embodiment of a read receipt. They registered my presence, acknowledged it on some superficial level, but felt no compulsion to engage. The loneliness was a physical ache, a coldness in the center of my being that no amount of layered clothing could warm. I watched the intricate dance of office politics, the alliances formed over shared complaints and weekend stories, the unspoken language of raised eyebrows and knowing smiles that cemented relationships and fast-tracked careers. I was a ghost at that feast, able to observe the festivities but unable to taste the food, my hunger for simple, human acknowledgement growing into a ravenous void. This systemic neglect was 1,000 tiny cuts, each one minor on its own, but collectively fatal to my spirit. There was the time the entire finance team, including the new intern, was copied on the memo about the revised quarterly bonuses, and my name was conspicuously absent. There was the company-wide photo on the main staircase, where I had been cropped out at the edge of the frame, my shoulder a blurry afterthought soon covered by the new branding. There was the day I solved the latency issue in the core trading algorithm, a problem that had cost the company millions and stumped the best engineers for months, and the congratulatory email from the CTO praised the collective effort of the dedicated team, my name lost in a list of a dozen people who had actively hindered the process. Each incident was a silent referendum on my value, and the vote was always unanimously against me. I began to doubt my own reality, wondering if I was in fact as insignificant as my treatment suggested. The resentment was no longer a spark but a slow, smoldering fire, banked by every ignored greeting, every appropriated idea, every vacant stare that passed through me as if I were made of smoke. I was not a person. I was a function, and a poorly appreciated one at that, living in a perpetual state of being professionally overlooked, my humanity slowly being sandblasted away by the relentless, gentle wind of their indifference. The end of their world was not announced with a scream, but with a whimper, a single dissonant chime from a monitor that was never supposed to display anything but serene, uninterrupted green. It was a Tuesday. I remember because the air in the office still carried the lazy, complacent energy of a Monday successfully survived. I was at my desk, deep in the silent, intricate architecture of a predictive model I built for my own edification, a fortress of logic where their indifference could not reach me. The first chime was an isolated curiosity. Then, another answered from the adjacent desk. And then, as if a dormant hive had been violently awakened, the entire trading floor erupted in a cacophony of panicked alerts. The sound was a physical thing. A wave of digital terror that washed over the cubicles and froze the mid-sentence smirks on the faces of the anointed ones. On the vast, central holographic display, the Ethelgard logo flickered and died, replaced by a cascade of error messages that bloomed like poisonous flowers. This was the Cascade, a name they would later give it in their post-mortem reports, a label to try and contain the unimaginable. I saw it for what it was the instant the first line of corrupted code flashed on a screen I'd been monitoring for weeks. The inevitable collapse of a palace built on sand, a foundation I had warned was riddled with faults they were too arrogant to even inspect. For a long suspended moment, there was a beautiful, pristine silence of pure shock. Then the chaos began. It was a clumsy, graceless thing. Men and women who commanded seven-figure salaries and spoke in the confident tones of market gods were suddenly reduced to frantic children, their fingers stabbing at unresponsive keyboards, their voices rising in pitch as they shouted meaningless commands into dead headsets. The stock ticker, that ever-flowing river of wealth and confidence, was a torrent of red, numbers plummeting with a speed that defied physics. The system wasn't just failing. It was unraveling, each thread of code snapping and pulling a dozen others into the void with it. I did not move. I became an island of absolute stillness in the raging sea of their panic. From my position in the shadows, I watched the drama unfold with a detached, almost academic curiosity. I saw Richard Hemsworth, the head of trading, his face the color of old parchment, repeatedly slam his fist on his desk as if physical force could intimidate a logic ghost. I saw Sarah Jenkins, the lead architect, frantically scrolling through lines of code, her eyes wide with the dawning horror of someone who has just realized they do not speak the language of the monster they have created. The first time one of them looked at me, it was an accident. A junior analyst, his voice cracking, suggested something about a backup protocol, and Hemsworth's wild, sweeping gaze just happened to land on me during its frantic arc. His eyes, glazed with terror, passed over me without seeing, as they always had. But then they snapped back. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible event, but in that room at that moment it felt louder than the screaming alarms. It was the first crack in the dam. He didn't say anything. He just stared, and in his eyes, the chaos seemed to reorder itself around a single terrible realization. The whisper started then, hesitant and disbelieving. The model. She built a model. Didn't she file a report? The protocols in the Q3 archive. Their voices were hushed, laced with a new kind of fear that was sharper and more personal than their fear of financial ruin. It was the fear of being wrong, the fear of having to confront the scale of their own myopia. The walk across the trading floor to Hemsworth's desk was the longest and shortest journey of my life. The path that had always been a no-man's land of averted gazes was now a tunnel of silent, desperate attention. Every eye was on me. The frantic typing had stopped. The shouts had died in their throats. The only sound was the relentless, mocking symphony of the alarms and the soft whisper of my shoes on the polished floor. I did not look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on Hemsworth, who seemed to have aged a decade in 10 minutes. He stood as I approached, his body language a confused tangle of authority and supplication. "You," he said, and the word was stripped of all its former condescension, rendered hollow and raw. "You saw this. In your reports." It wasn't a question. It was a confession. He didn't ask if I could help. The question was hanging in the air between us, thick and unspoken. He simply looked at me, and for the first time he truly saw me, not as a piece of office furniture but as a person, and in that moment I was the most terrifying person he had ever met. The catalyzing crisis was not the collapse of the servers or the bleeding of the stock ticker. The true crisis for them was the shattering of their entire worldview, the devastating understanding that their salvation, if it existed at all, resided in the hands of the one person they had worked so hard to make into a ghost. The silence that followed Hemsworth's unspoken plea was a different quality of quiet than the one I had known for years. This was not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of a vacuum, a void left by the collapse of their certainty, and it demanded to be filled. I held his gaze, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room pressing down on me, a collective, desperate pressure. I could feel the phantom ache of every ignored email, every stolen idea, every lunch eaten alone at this very desk. The heat of that old, smoldering resentment, which had been my only companion for so long, did not flare into a destructive rage. Instead, it cooled, hardened, and crystallized into something new. An absolute, unassailable clarity. This was the fulcrum. This was the moment the world, which had for so long been tilted against me, could be wrenched back into balance. A simple no would have been a petty, fleeting victory, the satisfaction of a match flaring in a vast darkness. But I did not want the darkness. I wanted the light. I wanted control. I let the silence stretch, allowing it to become uncomfortable, allowing the tension to coil so tightly in the room that I could see the pulse throbbing in Hemsworth's temple. The alarms continued their dirge, a stark reminder that my currency was time, and theirs was running out. I slowly, deliberately turned my head, my gaze sweeping across the frozen tableau of my colleagues. I saw Sarah Jenkins, her face a mask of terrified hope. I saw the junior analyst who had first mentioned my name, looking as if he had just unlocked a door and found a dragon waiting behind it. I met each of their stares not with anger, but with a calm, unnerving assessment, as if I were evaluating livestock. I was memorizing this moment, the taste of their collective desperation, a vintage I would savor for a long time to come. They were not asking a colleague for help. They were supplicants before an oracle, and they were only just beginning to understand the cost of a prophecy. When I finally spoke, my voice did not crack or waver. It was low, measured, and cut through the ambient noise with the precision of a scalpel. The cascade is propagating through the tertiary backup protocols you instituted to override my security warnings, I stated, not looking at Hemsworth but at the main display, as if reading a story written in a language only I could decipher. It's not a failure. It's a systemic rejection. You built a house on a fault line and are now surprised by the earthquake. I turned back to him. I can stop it. The 4 words hung in the air. A life raft tossed onto their turbulent sea. A wave of palpable, almost pathetic relief washed over his features. He opened his mouth, no doubt to utter some hollow corporate gratitude, to say thank you, as if this were a simple favor between co-workers. I raised a single hand, a gesture so small yet so absolute it stopped the words in his throat. But I am not an employee right now, I continued, my tone chillingly conversational. I am a consultant, and my terms are non-negotiable. The word terms landed in the room with the weight of a coffin lid slamming shut. This was the pivot, the point of no return. The plea in their eyes curdled into a dawning, horrified understanding. This was not a rescue mission. It was a negotiation for their survival, and I held all the cards. I outlined my conditions with a dispassionate clarity that left no room for debate. There would be no committee, no oversight, no second-guessing. I would have absolute unilateral command over every server, every line of code, every resource of this corporation until the crisis was resolved. My old security protocols, the ones they had mocked and dismantled, would be reinstated not just here, but across the entire global network with me as their sole administrator. My access level, currently a joke that barred me from the executive coffee machine, would be elevated to a tier that did not yet exist, a God mode that saw every transaction, every email, every secret. I did not ask. I stated. This was not a request for a promotion. It was a terms of surrender, and they were in no position to refuse. My agreement to help was not an act of forgiveness or team spirit. It was a hostile takeover, executed not with a boardroom vote, but with the ruthless leverage of their own catastrophic failure. I was no longer the ignored architect. I was the only firefighter in a city of their own arson, and I would own the hydrants before I turned them on. The moment my terms were accepted, a seismic shift occurred in the very atmosphere of the room. The frantic, chaotic energy did not dissipate, but it was instantly channeled, disciplined, and bent to my will. I did not rush. I did not shout. I walked to the Central Command Terminal, a station reserved for Hemsworth himself, and the small crowd of panicked executives parted before me like the Red Sea. The chair was still warm from his body, a final fading ghost of his former authority. I sat and the leather sighed, accepting a new weight. My fingers found the keyboard, and the first thing I did was not to fight the Cascade, but to deepen my control over it. I initiated a series of commands that severed the entire Ethelgard network from the outside world. A digital quarantine that locked everyone in this room, and every employee across the globe, inside my domain. There were gasps. "You're isolating us? We're bleeding billions," someone cried out. I did not turn. "A patient must be stabilized before surgery can begin," I replied, my voice calm, my eyes fixed on the cascading data. "The bleeding is preferable to the hemorrhage you were about to experience." This was the first lesson. My logic, so long ignored, was now law. My work was not the frantic patching they had attempted. It was a methodical, almost surgical dissection. I called up the architectural schematics of the system, the very blueprints I had drawn years ago, and which had been subsequently bastardized with their efficiency updates and streamlined protocols. I highlighted their additions in a sickly, venomous yellow on the main holographic display for all to see. "This," I said, pointing to a module Sarah Jenkins had been so proud of, "is the primary infection vector. It was designed without understanding the recursive authentication loop." My words were not an explanation for their benefit, but an indictment for the record. I began to dismantle their work, line by line, not with anger, but with a cold, dispassionate precision that was more terrifying than any outburst of rage could ever be. Each deleted line of their arrogant code was a brick removed from the wall of their professional legitimacy. I watched from the corner of my eye as Sarah flinched with every keystroke, her life's work, her accolades, being systematically erased from existence by the person whose warning she had filed away as unduly alarmist. As I worked, I built my new kingdom in the ruins of their old one. I did not simply restore my original security protocols. I reforged them, weaving in new layers of access control that were hard-coded to my biometrics, my fingerprint, my retinal pattern, my voice print. The system would now respond to me and me alone at its most fundamental level. I created a hidden administrative tier, a sanctum sanctorum within the digital architecture that was invisible to anyone else. From this throne room I could see everything. The real-time flow of capital, the secret R&D projects, the private communications of the board. I watched as the panic in the room slowly transformed into a stunned, fearful awe. They were no longer watching a technician fix a problem. They were watching a sovereign reclaim a usurped throne. And the process was as brutal as it was beautiful. The alarms, one by one, began to fall silent. The screaming red of the main display softened to a steady, vigilant amber, and then, with a final decisive command from my terminal, to a calm, profound, and universal green. The silence that returned was absolute, but it was a new kind of silence. It was the silence of a storm that has passed, leaving a forever altered landscape in its wake. The cascade was over. Contained. Defeated. I did not stand up and take a bow. I did not smile. I simply leaned back in the chair, steepled my fingers, and finally turned to face them. The crisis was resolved, but my work was not finished. The real seizure of control was just beginning. I had stopped the bleeding, but I now held the deed to the entire body. Their relief was palpable, but it was immediately poisoned by the terrifying understanding of the cost. They looked from the serene green screens back to me, sitting in their leader's chair, surrounded by the digital ghost of my own inviolable architecture. They had gotten what they asked for. They were saved. But in saving them, I had not handed them back their world. I had simply moved them into mine, a world where my rules were the only ones that mattered. And the first unbreakable rule was that the silence of my exile was now the silence of my absolute command. The green glow of the restored system did not signal a return to normalcy. It illuminated a new world, a world I had carved from the carcass of their failure. The palpable relief that washed over the trading floor was immediately followed by a chilling uncertainty. They were saved, yes, but they were now citizens of a nation they did not recognize, subject to a ruler they had never deemed fit to lead. The silence in the wake of the alarms was no longer filled with panic, but with a dense, awestruck fear. And it was in this fertile quiet that I began to build my new order. I did not vacate Hemsworth's chair. It was my chair now. I swiveled slowly, my gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, each one a pale mask of gratitude warring with terror. They waited for a speech, for a magnanimous gesture, for the familiar script where the hero modestly returns control to the rightful authorities. I offered them none of that. Instead, I began to issue commands, my voice no longer that of the overlooked analyst but that of the architect, the warden, and the final arbiter. I directed the legal team to my office, not the conference room, to draft the formal agreement that would codify the terms of my consultation into a permanent, unassailable executive position. I instructed HR to immediately revoke all universal administrative privileges and to begin the process of implementing the new, biometrically locked security hierarchy. Each directive was a brick, meticulously laid in the foundation of my absolute authority. The following days were not a celebration but a quiet, bloodless coup. My transition from ghost to sovereign was seamless, enforced by the very real and recent memory of the abyss from which I had pulled them. The board, shell-shocked and legally cornered by the emergency powers they had granted me, ratified my new title, Chief Architect of Systemic Integrity. The title was a bland corporate moniker that belied the terrifying scope of its power. It granted me a veto on all technological implementation, unfettered access to every data stream, and a reporting structure that had me answering to no one but a committee of which I was the permanent chair. My first act in this new role was to summon the department heads to the main conference room, the very room where my voice had so often dissolved into nothing. I did not stand at the foot of the table as I once had. I sat at its head and I watched them file in, their eyes darting nervously, unable to meet my gaze for more than a second. I did not smile. I placed a single printed document on the polished mahogany. It was the initial report I had filed 18 months prior, predicting the cascade with chilling accuracy. I let the silence stretch, let them read the date, let them remember their inaction. This, I said, my voice flat and cold, is the new standard. Any project, any update, any line of code that does not pass my review will be terminated. There will be no appeals process. My new office was a glass-walled corner suite that looked down upon the trading floor, a panopticon from which I could observe every flicker of activity. They would look up and see me there, a silent, constant reminder of the price of their salvation. The social dynamics of the floor shifted with a brutal, unspoken finality. Where once my presence at the coffee machine caused an exodus, it now created a frozen tableau. Conversations would halt, laughter would die, and people would stare with a mixture of reverence and pure, undiluted fear. They were not just afraid of my power to fire them, they were afraid of my knowledge, of the fact that I saw the shoddy workmanship in their code, the petty deceptions in their expense reports, the secret alliances and betrayals that threaded through their emails. I possessed the ultimate ledger, and they all knew they were in debt. The loneliness did not vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer the aching void of exclusion. It was the profound, chosen solitude of a monarch. I did not eat alone at my desk out of necessity anymore, but by design. My isolation was now a symbol of my position, a barrier that reinforced the new hierarchy. They had needed my help, and in granting it I had not simply fixed their problem. I had rewritten the fundamental contract of our existence. The rules were mine now, etched not in employee handbooks, but in the silent, humiliating memory of their failure and the unblinking, ever-watchful code that I alone commanded. The invisible one had become the inescapable one, and every quiet click of my keyboard, every calm directive, was the sound of my justice finally and permanently served.